to the Weekly Bioanalysis, a KCAS podcast.
Hello and welcome to the 36th episode of the Weekly Bioanalysis, the official podcast of KCAS, Bioanalytical and Biomarker services. KCAS is a bioanalytical CRO serving the pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical industries for over 40 years. My name is John Perkins and I've been in the bioanalytical LCMS space for over 26 years. I'm here with my co-host Dominic Guarino.
Hello, my name is Dominic Moreno, and I've been in the immunology and gene therapy space for a little over 26 years now.
Dominic and I are senior scientific advisors at KCAS, and either or both of us are available to answer any questions you may have regarding this podcast or any of KCAS's services. I'm located in upstate New York, Dom is in Kansas, and the people that we couldn't do this without, our producers, are in Missouri and Kansas City, so we're all over the map. We're thrilled to have you listening to the 36th episode of the podcast, which is now available virtually everywhere. Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and many others. Wherever you choose to find and play your podcast, you can now likely find the Weekly Bioanalysis. And of course, you can also continue listening to the podcast episodes via YouTube as well. We welcome all of you who are joining us for the first time using any of these new platforms. As many of you know, if you've listened to any of our previous episodes, we started the podcast when COVID restrictions prevented us from continuing business as usual. We were unable to meet face to face, but we wanted to continue communicating with all of you. The podcast was an idea we'd always had, but it suddenly became the perfect medium for us to employ. Today's podcast will be a review of the latest news and resources, and then a focus on the topic of our choosing before discussing any feedback we've had from you. We're constantly looking for topics, and we'd be happy to discuss something that you want us to cover. Then we'll wrap up, give you a little teaser for the next episode, let you know what is coming in the future. So again, we're fired up to have you here, and we're looking forward to a fun episode today. To kick us off for podcast number 36, Dom is going to go over today's podcast topic a bit before we jump into the news and resources section. Dom.
Yeah, John, absolutely. I'm excited to talk about the latest on COVID as we kick off podcast number 36. The first item is COVID vaccine results point the way out of the pandemic, and it leads us to Israel, John. This is really good news. Israel, I feel like, has always been somewhat of a case study is the way I think of it in terms of how to manage the pandemic here. They went down, they went into lockdown early and often, and we deal with some people in Israel, and they've shared their ups and downs. But certainly, I think now, in terms of the way they've rolled out the vaccine, in terms of the way they're handling the pandemic, they might be, the way out of this, right, John? So tell us a little bit more about this article.
Yeah, I think the key here is Israel has been very motivated about getting people vaccinated, and it's a relatively small population, so they can cover a decent percentage of the population quickly. In terms of countries around the world, Israel are well ahead in terms of proportion of their population vaccinated. I mean, of the 9 million people, more than a third have received one dose, 2 million of them have already had two doses. And what that is giving them the ability to see what the effect of, a larger group vaccinated, how's that affecting rates of infections, etc. And what they're seeing is that 6 weeks into vaccination campaign, they find that the number of new COVID-19 cases has dropped by 41% compared to 3 weeks earlier, and they're also seeing a big drop in hospitalizations from the coronavirus and a drop in the number of people who are becoming critically ill. So really showing that in this case, it's mainly the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine is doing its job and really having a positive effect.
Yeah, it looks like it's 91% efficacy or something like that. They've had almost good numbers, good numbers, John. It's there's some other little nuggets of information that are interesting. I think there's an advantage to just the general way they operate in Israel to allow them to have this. But the Maccabi Health Center says that of the nearly 500,000 people that have been vaccinated, only a couple hundred got the COVID-19 a week after their second dose. So they're actually looking like they're pretty effective in terms of, about 91% is what it says here in terms of
Yeah.
preventing COVID.
So yeah, when we talked about clinical trials, we were talking about these efficacy rates in excess of 90%. But here's the real world example saying yes, it still is 91% in this population.
Yeah, and
And
they
the other part of it is actually within the Israeli population, there's the B117
yeah.
variant, which originated in the UK, actually predominates there, and it's been shown to be effective against that variant. So, at least in terms of if the vaccine is rolled out, it's doing its job, and this is generally good news. Although Israel, I mean, they've still got pockets of the population who are resistant to taking the vaccine, mainly Orthodox Jews and the Arabic population. But they're also they've actually had to extend their third nationwide lockdown, which they're putting down possibly to more lackadaisical compliance with the lockdown, the needs of a lockdown, and because the B117 variant is that bit more infectious than the original variant of the virus, but
Yeah.
generally positive.
No, really, it is. It looks like it's positive against the variant there, and as well as, like you said, they're actually giving it to 16 and older, which is fantastic as well. So they feel
Yeah,
like that got lowered as well. So really nice way to kick us off, John, in terms of some real positive news on the uh, vaccine front, and certainly something that we hope we can build upon here in the U.S. and around the world to ensure, they got, like you said, about a third of the population already vaccinated, which is fantastic. So, John, maybe we'll move on to our next COVID related topic, right? How
yeah.
safe does this?
The,
Okay, go
the,
ahead. You kick us
the,
off.
the next topic actually relates as well, and this is how safe does this make my family member? What doctors should tell patients about COVID-19 vaccine? And this was a discussion with the Infectious Disease Society of America, and talking about if you've been vaccinated, doctors should the advice from doctors is to continue following safety protocols such as mask wearing, hand washing, and social distancing. So it's obviously Israel looks optimistic, but right now we don't have sufficient evidence to say that vaccines will stop a person who is vaccinated transmitting the virus to others. So it
Mm.
still makes sense to keep those controls in place.
But John, shouldn't we just be doing some of this like in perpetude, or should have been doing it long before? I mean, maybe not the mask wearing, but at least social distancing and cleanliness and all that. I mean, I don't know that, but you're right. I think the worst thing we can do is have people who are vaccinated thinking they're, you know, no pun intended, immune to things. So they're running around and really all they're doing is transmitting it because they're not wearing a mask and really letting their guard down. So I think it's important. Good,
That,
good
that's
thing
that's
to touch on.
That's a really good question. We were just hopping around on TV a couple of nights ago, and it was someone talking about COVID, and really, yeah, I know what it was. It was actually on John Oliver, but it was the point that was being made was extremely valid. It was I can't remember who the person was talking, but it was really she was saying that once the history has been with pandemics, what we've done, or like these kind of viruses, when we've actually got it under control, we've gone completely back to business as usual, and we haven't changed our habits. And she was saying what we probably should be doing, because there is the expectation that another pandemic will follow, because we've had this this almost conveyor belt of viruses moving from animals into man, that we really do need to look about how do we behave in the longer term to prevent this happening. She didn't say any details about what could be done, so it sort of left the question hanging, and certainly me wanting to know more about what would be done, because it's a really interesting discussion.
Yeah.
But I think it's something that needs to be, it should be out there, and this should be driving policy.
Yeah, I mean, it could be I don't know if a world with a mask is the solution, but maybe it's as we advance in, testing technology. There's even sniffing dogs that can sort things out. They're using them at NBA arenas. Maybe it's like, if you have any inkling, a mask goes on and it kind of lets people know you're wearing a mask. And so I don't know if that's some sort of solution, but I agree, John. I think the way we behave. I don't know if it'll be as extreme as like we're never going to shake hands and stuff of that nature, because that's just, I don't know, maybe but it's a good thing to think about and talk about, and certainly to be determined. But
Yeah, and
clearly,
I hope there's more discussion about it in the future, and certainly if there is, we'll cover it.
yeah,
And one final thing as part of this, although they're saying we don't yet have enough evidence to say that vaccines are preventing or a vaccinated person doesn't transmit. Oxford AstraZeneca, they had a study that actually showed data that with their vaccine cuts transmission by about 2/3. So if that translated across the vaccines that have all been rolled out, there will be some protection from vaccinated for people from vaccinated, but it's still early days on that.
yeah. I mean, I think we're going to go towards the way of the flu and how it works there. And each year it might be a little bit of a different cocktail in the vaccine, but or maybe even a cocktail of the two, because I don't think COVID's going anywhere. Probably been around longer than we really give it credit for. It's just kind of hit a strain that probably
Yep.
caused some of this outbreak. But yeah, no, I think it's what we could probably talk the whole podcast on that, John, because it is a fascinating discussion. I'm sure you, like me, sit around the dinner table and talk about when are we going to have to stop wearing these masks and things of that nature.
Yep.
So, John, let's move on to our next topic. It's around, why don't you kick us off? It's around
Sure.
Merck, right? Expands its deal, more about vaccine manufacturing bottlenecks.
Yeah, so it's like we've been doing this podcast since last April, and it's like it's like the bus thing with Merck KGA. We haven't talked about them since April, and then they pop up twice in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Merck KGA expands its deal with Pfizer BioNTech with an eye on key vaccine manufacturing bottleneck, and Merck haven't been doing anything on the vaccine front, but they are a very key part of the Pfizer vaccine mechanism of how it works. They actually produce lipids that are basically there for delivering the vaccine into the body. I actually picked up something from another site where it's saying that RNA is very unstable and mRNA vaccines must reach the lymph nodes to work. So the BioNTech version of the vaccine use small lipid nanoparticles to protect the core mRNA information. When the nanoparticles degrade, they release the mRNA at the point of reaching target tissue, and then the mRNA itself also quickly degrades after protein translation. So that it's a key part of that mechanism. So if Pfizer announced that they were actually looking to step up, not only in terms of the number of doses they're hoping to produce this year. I think they're going from something like 1.3 to 2 billion doses this year, and also cut the time of manufacture from 110 to 60 days. But if they're doing that, other people in the supply chain have to do the same, and these lipids are not an easy thing to produce. It's basically there's only a select few manufacturers are currently equipped to manufacture lipids in standards consistent enough for vaccine production. So Merck KGA are really critical to this whole rollout.
Yeah, so I'm gonna maybe rehash a little bit just so the audience catches some of, because you said a lot of things and maybe everybody doesn't follow some of that. But like when you hear the word nano technology, nanoparticles, one of what we use in drug development is what you just said. They take a lipid, which is just literally fatty acids and a lipid bilayer, and it forms like a missile. It's called. I think of it that way. It's like a particle, and within that, it encapsulates the mRNA and stabilizes it. Right, John? So
Yep.
that's an advancement in allowing for probably storage of it, as well as like dosing. And when it hits the body, the lipids will eventually fall apart, and then it releases the drug, and in this case the mRNA. So great technology, been around. Merck is a master at it. They do it in gene therapies with like AAV particles is another way to do it. But this again leads towards that collaboration that we hadn't seen pre-COVID. No way would Merck have been opening up their manufacturing facility for a competitor, because that's what's happening here, and they're doing
Yes.
it for Novartis as well. So it's that collaboration partnership for world health that hopefully sets the stage for cancer and everything else, John. But this is a wonderful, Merck, we talked about how some of their, and I know it's Merck Germany, but still some of their vaccines have fell a little short. Well, they're still pitching in, and really it's a good business decision on their part, not just to to help with world health in general. But why would they not take advantage of the manufacturing they have and let
So
others
I,
competitors
I
outsource
will
it?
I will clarify. It's actually two different Mercs. So
Yes,
it
yes.
all originated in Germany, but then within World War Two, it was basically Merck that was over here. I suppose requisitioned by the U.S. government and basically became a U.S. company, whereas Merck KGA, who are the originator, continued in Germany as two separate entities. So we
They
talked.
are. You're right. They still, I think, they still do a lot of collaboration between Merck and Merck KGA. But you're right; they are separate companies.
Sure. Yeah, so that's really the split between the two companies. So Merck KGA, when we talked about them last week, was more in terms of the birth helping births, etc. Merck in the US were the ones who have that big history in terms of vaccine production. But
Yeah.
let's move on. That was just to clarify the two Mercks, and if anyone's ever, because it's confusing even for us. I remember
Yeah,
the
I misspeak all the time, and I call them Merck Germany, which is probably
yeah,
not right
I
at
mean,
all.
when I worked in the Netherlands, I was actually working on what was a Merck site, but it was Merck US and not Merck Germany because the reason why that had happened was the site was actually Organon, who were a big pharma company in the Netherlands, who were then bought by Shearing Plough, who were then bought by Merck, and then so of course that.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a name I
that
haven't heard.
site. Yeah.
Shearing Plow, that's an old one, but we're going to move on, John.
Yeah,
Yeah, right. There's a lot of
no,
history there, and it's interesting stuff.
yeah, the
Um,
all the acquisitions and mergers are always a fascinating thing. So those are the bigger articles with COVID, but there's been a lot happening. So I thought it made sense just to talk very briefly about, I think, four or five other things and just say the highlights. So we'll spend like a few seconds on each because
mhm.
there isn't much more to say, but it's really worth highlighting how things are moving forward. And the first of those is we've this has been a vaccine that we've mentioned on a reasonable number of times, but still largely flown under the radar compared to the high-profile mRNA vaccines, and this is the J&J vaccine, which is, they've Johnson and Johnson have filed for emergency authorization, and the FDA have said they're going to have the meeting to discuss the Johnson and Johnson vaccine on February 26th. So that could be a if that is given emergency use authorization, we have another vaccine. This one's single dose, but also has that ambient temperature stability that the mRNA vaccines to date don't have. So there's a number of reasons why it would be a key resource if it's authorized to go ahead.
Yeah. No, John, you summed it up. Maybe I'll just move on to the
Mm,
next one, and I'll just touch that. J&J has
sure.
that doesn't need the cold chain, can be kept at refrigerated temperatures, which is the big advantage and why it's still progressing at the rate it is. Then the next one is South Africa sidelines the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is with Oxford, right? After it failed to protect against new variant in the study. So it looks like that the efficacy against the B.1.351 variant dropped from, typically they were seeing 75% drops to 22%. That's a little bit of a setback, but I'm sure they can re-engineer that to increase over time. But no one should be. I hope that doesn't alarm people too much. But
Yeah,
they have shown that the mRNA vaccines do still the efficacy doesn't fall quite as much, showing much better promise. And then even the J&J vaccine, which you mentioned, is preventing a lot of cases and hospitalizations to the new variant. So let's not get too alarmed about the new variant, right?
yeah, I think what we're seeing is, like you mentioned, AstraZeneca are looking about how they can re-engineer to address this variant. The mRNA vaccines see a drop, but they're still effective. It's
Yeah.
just less effective. So yeah, it's not doom and gloom. But it's worth knowing about this stuff and the what different mutations can do in terms of how they react to the vaccines. I'll move on to the next one.
Yeah.
And this is another one that we hear about occasionally, but it's Sinovac, which is one of the two vaccines from China that had been in the lead. I think this is it's probably I'm not sure which population it was rolled out to in China in very early days, but more recently, phase 3 trials of the vaccine ongoing in Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and Chile. They're showing, they're reporting an efficacy of around 91.25% after 14 days. So I guess another possible vaccine that could be out there, and Sinovac are looking to get conditional market authorization in China, with a view to then moving on to other countries as well.
Yeah, no, it's good to see that. I think we're. Uh, I hope we can believe all that data, and certainly any vaccine that's helping lots of countries in this case, I think is a good story, John. So we're kind of doing rapid fire over the vaccine, which I think is cool. So the next one up is Eli Lilly racks up emergency use authorization for their antibody cocktail. So it's a combination of, and forgive me, John, bamlanivimab and etsuvimab. I guess I'm never very good at these, but
My take would be bamlanivimab and etesevimab, I think
yeah,
is how it is.
sure. But that cocktail of those two antibodies, and they've got some partners in there, but really the main take home here is it's reduced hospitalization by 70% among 1,000 patients that were given it. So that's really good news. And we've talked about not just the vaccine; it's a dual attack. Therapeutics are certainly playing an impact. Combinations of biologics; these are both monoclonal antibodies, really doing some great work. I'll just touch that one is
The-
co-developed by Abcellera, who it looks like a Chinese-based company, and then Amgen, who is a strong biologics out in Thousand Oaks,
I'll,
California.
I'll I'll clarify on that. Just to say, this emergency use authorization is for patients with mild to moderate disease, and I think that tends to be an area that we don't have much available. Dexamethasone is much more for severe cases. So banlanivimab is the Abcellera, and I don't know much about them as a company. And then the etesevimab came from Yunxi in China. So one's a partner, one that I think Lilly have in licensed. So yeah, it's although one other key thing is this authorization actually, they've figured out that it doesn't need long infusion times, or they can reduce the infusion times. So again, it makes it easier on the doctors, nurses, and patients. So it's still an infusion, so there is some time where you're set with a drip in your arm, but at least they're working on making it more convenient. So
Yeah, it's a
old
good point.
progress.
Thanks
Yes.
for clarifying all that. And then you're right. Amgen actually, again, more collaboration. They help with the manufacturing of the Estuvimab from the Junshi in China. So great, John. Thanks for clarifying all that. But you're right. This is more in that space where um, they're recently diagnosed, so mild to moderate, really a sweet spot, right, John? That I think to the audience out there, if you do get it, there's hope, and
Hmm.
that would be a good standard of care. We hope to see as you before you progress to a state where they want to give you, more like the dexamethasone type treatments, right? So very
Sure.
good stuff.
Yep. So,
Um,
shall I move on?
yeah,
So
yeah,
this is now we're on US Merck, where it's basically, and this comes back to the collaboration thing, which is why I keep throwing these in there, because I think it's a great story that is ongoing, and this is now, we talked last week about Merck dropping their own investigative vaccines. They have therapeutics for COVID in development, but it was really they thought then was that they were out of vaccines and leaving it to other people, but they're in talks with governments, health agencies, and other pharma companies to get involved in the manufacture and to identify other areas in the pandemic response where they can help. So I think it pops up somewhere else later. Pharma companies are definitely seeing that this is too important not to all be in this together. So even if their direct efforts aren't working, it's very much the focus of how can they help longer term, because this is a team effort.
yeah. No, I think that will wrap us up on the COVID front. I
With
um,
one last
oh,
piece, that Teva has also announced that they're in talks to help with vaccine production. So we haven't
sure.
talked about Teva at all the way through this podcast, but there's another big international name popping up saying that we're here to help.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right. We haven't, if our audience isn't familiar with, I call them Teva, but it's probably Teva, right? They're a big generics company, right, John? And we haven't talked too much about them at all. They are definitely one of the giants in our industry, and it's good to see them popping up on the vaccine production front, as you mentioned. So,
Hmm.
a good point there. Yeah. So, John, let's kind of we'll close out the latest on COVID. We got a couple quick highlights on non-COVID related news and my big friend, CAR T cell therapies, right? But there's a new study showing why CAR T cell therapy may fail in some lymphoma patients, which tell us a little bit more about this and what's happening at the Moffitt Cancer Center.
I'm not going to tell you much about it. I'm throwing it out there. So this is a throwing your bones. You got something to get really, really involved
Well, I
with.
wanted you to tee it up for me, John. That's what I'm hoping. You tee it up and I can knock it down. But yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yes, it's scientists at the Moffitt Cancer Center showed immune dysregulation might be to blame for lackluster responses to Gilead's CAR T therapy Yescarta among patients with diffuse large B cell lymphoma. Basically, they're saying that patients who didn't respond well to treatment had significantly higher expression of genes related to tumor interferon signaling than did responders. So I'm going to let you go ahead and see what you think of this.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the challenges with CAR T cell therapies, especially in spaces like lymphoma or any sort of blood cancer, is how I kind of think of that because now they're immunological disorders to begin with, and then if it's a CAR T cell that's against a solid tumor or a cancer, that dysregulation is usually due to some sort of epithelial or endothelial type mutations, and then T cells that are either exhausted or just haven't been able to remedy the cancer or tumor. So when you target CAR T cells that way, that has a different sort of what I think of as angle, and I won't go into too much more on that. But when you target a blood tumor like this, it's not surprising to see what they call a dysregularity because you are trying to in especially large B cell lymphomas, like people will have circulating, I think of them as mature B cells. That's actually what like a plasma cell is, and they're producing typically antibodies against a specific clone, but that B cell can take up like I forget some of the numbers, but it's a huge percentage where normally a given B cell will be at like less than 1% or 0.1% or something like that. It'll take up like 20 or 30 or 50 or 90% of a patient's B cells will be flow cytometrically expressing the same like B cell receptor. So when you get these CAR T cells, it's not surprising that you might have some dysregulation. They talk about part of the checkpoint inhibitors playing a role. That's the 41BB protein um, that's involved. And I think they're still trying to figure out exactly what the issue is that's preventing them from being as effective as it's seen. It's also got, they talk about ferritin, which they call a cytokine, but that's like an iron byproduct, which is it's an inflammation marker, but that's also, an indication that if they have a high level of that, it's meaning they're not responding to the Yescarta. So
Hmm.
it's still a little bit to tease out there, but this is great because I think when I say great, it's a shame it's not working as effective for these patients, but they've also started to identify the problem, how they're going to remedy it, and this is where it's fascinating to see science again be able to sort of target the immune system. I mean, these are things that back in the early 90s when we were looking at autologous T cell therapies and that was like a black box. We didn't really know about antigen presenting cells. We didn't really know just unearthing the lock and key concepts of T cell receptors and MHC, and to see it come so far in even my lifetime, because I still feel like I got a lot left in the tank, John. This
Hmm.
is fascinating to me in terms of how they're really starting to unlock the power of T cell therapy, specifically CAR T cell therapy. So there's my
Sure.
diatribe on things,
And
John.
and that sticking in with things and learning from it, I think actually tees up the next story nicely as well. And this is moving into gene therapy, where I mean I'm still trying to pick this up as we talk about it, week to week. But certainly in the news recently, there has been a number of trials that have been put on hold because of adverse events in trials, etc. But this is Avro Bio, who they actually they're focused on lysosomal disorders, where they're basically enzymes malfunctioning within the body, and trying to cure those. So they're mostly rare genetic diseases, and in this case, Fabry disease, which is caused by deficiency of an enzyme called alpha galactosidase, and with fewer than 200,000 cases per year in the US. But what they had a small clinical trial, and they basically have shown that a year after dosing, the first patient given the commercial form of their gene therapy saw 100% in kidney substrate, which is at the endpoint that the FDA monitors. And reading down the article, is actually 3 of the 5 patients are off enzyme replacement therapy, with the first patient now responding for 3.5 years. So, I mean, although it's small, it's really showing the potential of gene therapy and what a difference it can make to people.
Yeah, exactly, John. This is a stem cell therapy, slightly different than CAR T cell therapies, but just an amazing. I want that to set in. So, with a single injection, normally enzyme replacements are things that if you do treat it like biologics and stuff, you need to be getting hospitalizations for infusions on a routine basis. Single injection, 3.5 years later, a patient, 3 out of 5, right? One of them has
Yep.
gone 3.5 years. That is absolutely fantastic. Certainly, we've got some familiarity with this company, and really fascinating. Love it, and not just CAR T cells, but often underappreciated is other gene therapies in the cellular space, most notably stem cell therapies, as well as even like macrophage therapeutics, which is another couple companies working on that. So yeah, John, it is a great story.
So that's there's no investment news this time. So let's move on to the main topic. And we thought we're actually covering something we've not really touched on before, and this is trends in drug development and the impact on consumer costs. So as we've talked, one piece we have talked about previously is we have, there's a very defined drug discovery and development process where drugs will be, you'll have your identified potential candidate will go into early drug discovery, and that will include things like target identification and validation, assay development screening, high throughput screenings to determine the physical chemical properties of the, at least in the case of a small molecule, and then lead optimization of say a number of compounds. Those then move into preclinical, so you're now doing safety testing in rodent species, then larger species such as dog or non-human primate. Then they move into clinical development. That's phase 1, where you're looking at safety. Moving into later phases where you're looking at efficacy in target patient populations. Then it's FDA review, and then into post-marketing monitoring, and the drug is on the market. So we thought it might be just good to talk about, what it means for developing small molecule drugs versus large molecule drugs. For small molecule, they're prepared via synthetic pathway. So I mean, it's a recipe. I mean, once you have that recipe tied down, it's every time you go through that process, you will get the same product out at the end of it. And also, it can be easily tweaked if you learn more about the molecule. I was doing a bunch of digging around, and atorvastatin is a really good example because it actually plays into a lot we want to talk about. So atorvastatin at one time was the largest selling drug on the market, anti-cholesterol drug marketed as Lipitor. And so it's initially, when it was first synthesized in the very, very early stages, it was made as a racemate. But they found that it's one enantiomer drives the efficacy. And in looking during preclinical, process chemists actually figured out if they changed the precursors, they could not only come up with a scalable and quicker synthesis route, but process chemists work out they could come up with a scalable synthesis route. It is also quicker. So again, it helps the manufacture process. So like I say, small molecule is the relatively simple piece. Large molecule, I don't know much about it, but I know it's much
Yeah.
more complex, which is why I thought I'd pass it on to you.
And you say small molecule is relatively simple, although a lot of what you said was like fascinating to me. So don't underscore how complex you just stated things. But on the large molecule, very similar, John. So in terms of today's topic, we're talking trends in drug development, the impact on the consumer cost. So large molecules. Just quickly, I'll kind of give the last decade summary, or maybe even going back to maybe 20 years ago. The first monoclonal antibodies that came out were either murine in nature, things like OKT3, which is an anti-CD3 antibody, still used in a anti. It's still used in it's still used in transplantation settings because it really just almost ablates the immune system. It just knocks out all CD3 cells and allows for transplantation. It's still used there, and we still use it routinely in flow cytometry. Again, that's a 100% murine antibody against the CD3 receptor and one of the first therapeutics. And some of the early IL-2 antibodies where they were trying to sop up a very potent cytokine to help with sorry, I said that wrong. Anyhow, OKT3 was one of the first biologics in terms of monoclonal antibodies. Then as they progressed, they started to make what I think of as chimeric versions. So human parts of the antibody. So the technology started to allow for more human pieces of the antibody framework, the FC and the FAB and things like that. And then just elements of it were still of a different species, most notably typically mice. And there are many antibodies on the market that still use that technology, but it moved towards fully humanized. And those are your things like Humira, and most of your antibodies that are on the market are fully humanized. And the technology on the large molecule side is the way it's synthesized. And usually it's the glycosylation process that is like part of the technology, because that becomes part of how immunogenic things can become. So there's been a lot of work to like knock out certain glycosylation sites to improve not just the pharmacokinetic of it, so the antibody might last a little bit longer, but doesn't cause any sort of immune response. And all along the way, this is the evolution of the anti-drug antibody field, essentially. So when you had a murine version, putatively, people would, because it's a murine antibody, they generate a lot of antibodies against the drug, and some of them are neutralizing. You get some sort of chimeric version of it should be less, and then a humanized version should be, even further less, almost none. But without going too much into it, the human ones, you still develop the immune system's so powerful that it's still frequently in a human setting, a humanized antibody, you still upwards of, 8, 10, as high as 20% are still going to generate antibodies against it, where some of those early murine ones and chimeric ones, they were like in the 80% or 50%. So it's an improvement in terms of allowing and preventing neutralizing antibodies is really what it's about. So it's a little bit more of a complex path, but I hope the things I want to iterate is in the biologic side, specifically monoclonal antibodies and even proteins in general, they've humanized them. That's really helped. And then some of the technology is how they're manufacturing them. Some of them do them in hollow fiber reactors. Some of them do them in living organisms. And all of that plays into the glycosylation process. And that's where the technology lies, keeping it circulating longer, yet not making it immunogenic.
Sure.
So, and then lastly, the interesting one is cetuximab, which is a chimeric. That is still a very potent treatment for head and neck tumors and other cancers, but it's a chimeric, and people have tried to make it. I believe it's against an IGF receptor. I can't quite recall what it's against, but people have made versions of it. So that's made in a I think it's a CHO cell line or some different cell line. It's not CHO, it's a different cell line, because a lot of monoclonals are made in CHO, but it's made in a cell line that actually produces a glycosylation, and it's quite immunogenic, but it's quite effective. So you see where I'm going, John? Like,
Sure.
so despite, you want to make all these advancements, but others that have tried to make that antibody and humanize it, it's not as effective. So there's a little bit of a balance there. So that's my 2 cents, and we can move on from just the overall drug development in terms of large molecules, and maybe we'll dive into the impact.
So just to touch or get the link. So sorry, with small molecule, scale up has got to be relatively easy or simple. How is
Yeah.
scale up for large molecule?
It is it's more, that's a big challenge. Any sort of protein scaling up, and that's something I had the good fortune of studying when I got my biochemistry master's degree. Scaling up is a big challenge in our world. It is not quite you're right. Small batches of things. Again, it's all in my simple mind. It's the glycosylation process as you go from making it in, say, a roller. It loses these roller bottles of 5 liters up to room size roller bottles. All along the way, you got to iterate. You go to 5 gallon, 500 gallons to bigger and bigger. All along that way, there's like slight alterations of typically the nutrients that are involved, because it's all media that's used and
Mhm.
all sorts of things. It's not like whatever you're doing on this 5 liter roller bottle method does not translate up, and that is some great science there. And it's still even a challenge, like at KCAS when we take a protein and label it with like a biotin or even a ruthenium, and we make a small, say we do half a mig of it. When we go to make 5 mgs of it, it might not look the same just because of the incorporation ratio of, say we used a 1 to 20 incorporation, meaning 1 parts of protein to 20 parts of the biotin. If we go to scale that up tenfold, we might have to alter that incorporation ratio. So
Sure.
sorry,
Yeah.
that's I hope that sheds a little bit of light. You're right, there are some more challenges there on the biologic side, and to me it's all due to the glycosylation or the site-specific amino acids that they're trying to put things on.
It's all really, like I said, all really helpful to the discussion. So moving on to the next piece, I thought, we talk about drug pricing has come up frequently in discussions, and so I thought let's just talk about what the research process actually means from discovery through to launch of an approved product. And there's estimates that discovery candidates, for this is small molecule, you'll start with anywhere between 5 and 10,000 chemical compounds. About 250 of those are sufficiently promising to go into preclinical work, with 10 of those then going on to phase one. Um, Tufts, Tufts Centre for Study of Drug Development looked at the 1980s and 1990s, found that only 21.5% of drugs that started phase one trials were eventually approved for marketing. And that was at a time when a lot of the things that they were looking at were almost like the low hanging fruit in terms of medical conditions. Between 2006 and 2015, that drugs entering phase ones are actually making it to market, that dropped to less than 10%, so 9.6%.
And
So, sorry, go on. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
John, is that I feel like a lot of that has to do with the failures of more biologics, right? Or is this solely
I think
small
this,
molecule?
I think this is mainly small molecule.
Okay, wow, wow,
Given the timing, I might be wrong, but I
yeah,
think it's still the general concept. I remember I've sat in lots of talks over the years where they show the funnel of drugs, and it really has always followed this route. The
yeah.
10,000, 250 to 10 to one.
And John, I wonder, like you said, there was an unmet need in the 80s and 90s around, cardiac and
Yep.
diabetic and
Yep.
statins. And then I also wonder if more rigorous regulations have led to some of that drop, but that could be a whole nother podcast to unpack. But fascinating numbers there,
Yeah,
John.
yeah, yeah.
Let's
If you
continue with your thoughts. Sorry. Yeah.
Have you ever talked to anyone who was involved in the days of pre like early 1980s and prior to that in terms of drug development? It was much more of a cowboy type approach to what it is now. We're much more held in check. It's always fascinating. So, I mean, certainly within pharma companies, there's this like there's been a shift in terms of trying to make intelligent decisions to kill drugs early to prevent spending money unnecessarily. But what I found in a couple of citations, the estimated cost for each approved drug is $2.6 billion.
Wow.
And so your drug pricing reflects that. You're not just recouping costs for that 2.6 billion isn't just recouping the cost of the drug that you've got to market. It's all the other failures that were part of that process too. And that's partially what drives your drug pricing. But then you also, when you start looking at, what's the drug applied for? We've got a rare disease such as we talked about the AvroBio. earlier. But if you've only got a small population and you're trying to recoup that investment, it's going to be priced high. Then you got, we talked about the manufacture of the biologics. If that's a costly scale-up process and your manufacturing is costly, then that's going to be expensive. And
Yeah.
then gene therapy is, you've got very few administrations where you may have very few administrations on a rare disease. So the price of those is, I mean, when you see some of these more, in terms of very specialized drugs, when they're approved, and then you see the proposed pricing, it's sort of mind blowing to see the cost per dose. But there's a real reason behind that.
Yeah, no, sorry, John. There's so many things that you just that was a lot, right? So when
Sure.
you say the estimated cost, I'm going to start there. Of each drug is 2.6 billion. I want that to set in. That means that's not the actual cost for a given drug to get approved, because those numbers. So when I first started, we used to say, oh, it's going to take 10 years and like 30 million. Well, now it's like 5 years, so that's good, but it's like 300 million, I think, is the last stat I saw that it costs for a given drug to work its way through. That's just the overall cost for, preclinical. You talked about the couple species. So somewhere in there, it's probably a little north of 300 million to 400 million, just depends on the size of the trial, right? But that's just a given drug to get approved. But based off of the failure and everything, it's 2.6 billion per drug. Yeah. So when people ask why it's expensive, I mean, that's it. I mean, and then you factor in, when you give like a small molecule oral pill, they're on that for life, right? But if you're given a gene therapy, you got to recoup that. That's why you've heard a lot of like pushback on companies like BioMarin. They're in the gene therapy space. They used to have these like doses. They've really improved some of the biologics, and their doses, their treatments would be like $500,000 a year or something outrageous. But, in defense of BioMarin, look, that's it, right? It's not like they're getting 6 treatments and they're getting $3 million for it, right? So, and then of course you factor in the sheer number of people they're treating. To me, it makes sense. And I don't know too many people that pay out of pocket for it, right? I think it's a lot of
Sure.
subsidized.
Yes.
And just that should never be the reason why someone doesn't get a therapy, but it's a reality, right? We have to live in a reality. So, yeah, John, a lot of cool stuff you mentioned there. I'll give you the final word before we go on to the next topic.
I don't have much more to add. I think I'll
Yeah.
just go on to the next topic. And so there's a process here in play, that there is a counterbalance that brings prices down. And so when a drug is first, a company, I'll just talk small molecule. If they come up with a structure and an indication, they're going to patent the drug, or actually probably just the structure. They'll patent the drug. And that then has a lifetime where they can get that investigative molecule through to market, and then obviously sell it to the patient population. However, once the patent expires, then there's the opening for generic drug companies to produce a identical copy of that drug. But what they're going to, obviously they're going to focus, because they're looking at revenue. They're going to focus on those drugs that have been the big sellers, and this is why I mentioned atorvastatin earlier. Lipitor is a really good case in point. So peak sales for Pfizer, for atorvastatin, were 13.4 billion annually. But once they stopped making, once the protection from patents ceased, the monthly sales halved in 1 month. So we'll talk more about some of the stuff that Pfizer did to sort of try and maintain their revenue stream. But the reason why generic drugs are cheaper is they don't have the same extensive testing, because we've shown safety and efficacy in human and animals. So we know that the drug is okay. What they have to meet in terms of testing, they still go through a rigorous review process with the FDA, but they have to show things like that the drug is pharmaceutically equivalent to the patented molecule, and it's the same dose form. They have the ability to consistently manufacture their active ingredients same, and that the drug delivers the same amount of active component at the same time as the patented drug. For a generic drug company, the number of trials they need to run is much smaller, probably a couple. around in the region of 1 or 2, so they can afford to price much cheaper because they haven't had to make that same huge investment into research. Large molecule is different. We'll touch on that later, but at
Yeah.
least that's the small molecule piece of it.
No, I think you summed it up nicely. I don't have too much to add there. I just think there's a richer history is what the
Sure.
generic space has been an ongoing thing for, the last, for at least for me personally, over the last 10 years. It's been sort of more of a lot of regulatory changes, a lot more competition in that space. And really, I think the cost savings to the end user, us, the consumer, is much more affordable. So when you look at, I touched on Teva, for instance, right? Like if you get the brand name, it's, I don't know, maybe $10 a pill. If you can get a generic version, it's like $1 or something, right? So there's
Sure.
a huge cost
Yep.
savings. And
Yep.
so on the biologic space, it's really strange because there is a major biologic coming off. It's Humira is one, and several others are starting to come off patent. And it's interesting because they're not called generics; they call them biosimilars. Um, and the biosimilar, it's only like a 20% savings, John. So they still, despite like knowing the roadmap, they still have to go through a large series because of the immunogenicity component of it
Sure.
and the manufacturing differences. And in fact, if something's made in the US or made in Europe, it's almost like two different drugs, even though they're the same drug, because the manufacturing process can be so variable. We talked about that. It's not just
Mhm.
scaling. Even if you got the identical sort of equipment here in the US or at multiple sites, they see pretty big differences in the immunogenicity profile, not so much the PK profile or the potency of it per se, but because of that, they still have to go like generics. They can do some bioequivalency studies and much more focused and get the drug on market. Where a biologic, it's still sometimes it can be a longer path to sort of go down. Because they know where the FDA knows where to focus on. Hey, you need to do these immunogenicity, you need to do these biomarkers because someone's already proven it. So it can actually be more expensive to bring a biosimilar to market. And for that reason, the cost savings isn't to the consumer. I mean,
Sure.
20% is significant, but it's nothing like a small molecule medication where it's unbelievable how much you can save with a generic, right? So I
Yeah,
hope that made sense.
I found the table just again while jumping around, and it's saying a bunch of differences between biosimilars and generic chemical drugs or small molecule, but the cost for development for generic drugs, the small molecule, is around to 3 to 5 million per molecule, whereas for biosimilars, it's at least according to this source was 100 to 200 million per molecule. So you can see the difference there.
Yeah. And actually the reason why that's not, I mentioned the 300 million, they have gotten better in the biosimilar space to not do a double blinded trial. They don't
Hmm.
need to do that. And that's why it's much more expensive to do an innovative drug. And what I mean by that is they don't have to dose normals in their when they blind them because they know it's going to be effective in a biosimilar. So that is part of the reason why you're seeing this 200 million. And what a big variable that is, right? 100 to 200 million per molecule
Sure.
is not a small amount. So yeah,
Yeah.
and sorry, John, I just now realized I skipped around on you a little
No,
bit, but it's all good. I think we're
I think it's
heading up on
absolutely
the.
right.
I think we're going to have to cut this off a little bit. We got a couple more topics. Why don't you
Sure. No,
let's spend the next 10 minutes and we can close this out here.
yeah, I think just one more thing. I think just as key mentioning bioanalytical is so for generic small molecules, um, the like I say, they only really require a couple of studies that are showing what we call bioequivalence. So it's a comparison between the the generic drug and the patented molecule. And again, we're talking a small investment per molecule for a generic company. So we find that it's a price drives how they contract out. And I had an experience years ago where we were dealing with a generic company from India, and the price that they were willing to pay per analysis was way different to what we were normally used to. So it meant then that in terms of it sort of made you really think about how can we make things more efficient such that we can you know we're operating in the margins that we're used to. So it's a very different business model from the standard pharmaceutical companies when you're dealing with bioanalytical. But the bioequivalence trials are really, really, really important. So there is a lot of obviously there's a lot of companies will support those.
Yeah, John, I think I don't have too much to add. I think you had some good examples of drugs that fell into. I like the way you pay for delay, right? And that happens I know that happens in the um, biosimilar space as well. In terms of like a lot of companies will go out of their way to challenge a given
Sure. Yeah.
biosimilar, and that's similar to what you sort of touched on. I don't know if you want to take a moment and give
Yeah,
some
I'll,
examples.
I'll just give a bit of an intro. I mean, really, we talked about the patented drug, then the generic companies come in. But if we're talking an asset for a pharmaceutical company that has been a big deliverer of revenue, they're going to try and protect that. And there's a number of ways that they can do it. The pay for delay is that I wish I again this was on the subject of atorvastatin, where Pfizer, where Ranbaxy were the first company to get licensed to produce a generic, but then Pfizer worked with them to say, if we pay you this, can you delay launch? Which then means it delays other people launching their own generic versions because there's time frames associated with it. So the first person granted is a 180-day exclusivity period, and then there's other financial approaches to a get patients to a um, coupon schemes for patients, things like that. But that's actually some of the more interesting approaches in terms of extending patents are things like you actually, if you launch an over the counter version, that can extend it, but it gives 3 years further exclusivity. But you have to justify that it doesn't need doctor intervention in terms of you don't need a prescription involved. And then there's, I mean, omeprazole is a great example. It was marketed as Prilosec, is a protein pump inhibitor, and omeprazole is the racemate. So it's but what I think that was, I can't remember which pharma company. I think it's AstraZeneca. They purified esomeprazole, which is the more active form of omeprazole, and so that then extended the patent much further because they showed that esomeprazole was actually more eff, efficacious than omeprazole alone. So there's all these different things that you can do. And another one that I've been involved in studies supporting this kind of effort is where you have two drugs that are going roughly in the same therapeutic area, but they operate slightly differently. And the example I found was Symbyax, which is a combination of Zyprexa and Prozac, where they're both used to treat bipolar disorder, but by combining them in a single dose with both molecules there, then you extend the patent lifetime, and it's a patented molecule, and you hold the generics off. So there's a lot of toing and froing in the whole
Yeah, yeah,
industry.
and they do the same thing in the biologic space, and they call it a bio better, John. I don't know if you've heard that term, right? So what they do is they'll
I haven't. That's a new one on me.
yeah, so like there's one particular drug, and I don't want to. I guess I don't need to necessarily say the name of the company, but it was a treatment for multiple myeloma that was an injection. And so and it was highly successful. It was a proteasome inhibitor, a really successful drug, and a lot of people were going to market it to compete against it. And so what they did as an organization is they made an oral version of it. And that's a bio better. And that really led to obviously the huge upside from not having to go to the hospital and make an oral version. A lot of other little kind of, I think of them as tricks that they'll do is indications, right? So a given drug might be approved for a single indication like Humira. AbbVie's gone out of their way to get it, approved for a whole variety of things outside of just I think it was first approved for like psoriasis or something, but it's or some sort of it's some sort of inflammatory bowel disease, but now it's used for psoriasis and a whole bunch of things. So that's another way they can kind of continue to make money off of the franchise blockbuster drug. And then there's also a lot of things get held up, just as you described, where give someone a first right of partner with the generic or somebody, so that it's really just all coming back to the original innovator drug, like unlocking the secrets, so to speak, and allowing it to go to market. Because there is a lot of um, you know, the biologic, and I think this is a good segue to the maybe the last thing is some of the challenges and differences between
Yeah,
biologics and small molecule. I think we can segue into that, but likewise, John, there's a lot of little chicanery is maybe the word that comes to mind when it comes to the biosimilar. And as I mentioned, I threw a word out there, a bio better world for you, which is maybe a dated term. They call it something else now. I'm showing my age a little. But anyway, John, let's wrap this up. And this has been a wonderful discussion, really interesting stuff. I hope people appreciate drug development and how it's impacting you as the consumer. But take us home, John. Let's touch
yeah.
on this last
I
point.
think it's to wrap this up. There has actually been 29 biosimilars approved by the FDA since 2015. So there's, I mean, that's a fair number per year. But like you said, it was only they only seen that minor cost reduction. Do you think that will ever change, or what's your long term expectation of the biosimilars on large molecule therapeutic pricing?
Yeah, that John, that's a big question, because when I first thought of this, I was like thinking like a small molecule, right? Like, oh my goodness,
Yep,
you can take something that could cost, thousands of tens of thousands of dollars down to maybe $1,000. I don't. I think for just sheer cost, I don't. I think it's not going to go much. It just won't get too much better because it's still
sure.
very expensive to bring it to market. Until that gets improved, I don't think you'll see the price go down. So there's my answer.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because the trend in therapeutics is to the large molecule end of things. So although you saw it very much if there's a small if there's a large number of small molecules, generics can bring the price down. But if you've got a large number of large molecule, it's still going to be expensive because of the nature of the business. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, it's still, even though it's like, I think I'm seeing some numbers here, like, the cost reduction, I said about 20%, but it can be upwards of, it looks like 35%, right? But that's still in a $140 billion market as of 2011. That's a significant savings if you put,
Mhm.
in terms of, so maybe I'm underselling the value of a biosimilar. I'm having the good fortune of never having to need a biologic, and knock on wood, I hope I don't ever need one. But maybe that savings is much larger than it is in my mind. But when you compare it to if you've ever gotten even omeprazole or something like that, the generic version versus the off the shelf one, and you're like, well, why would I pay $14 for a pill for when I get it for two,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyhow,
Yep.
good discussion, John. I don't have any parting thoughts. I hope our audience appreciates this little walk down drug development and the impact on your costs. John, I don't know any other final words, and otherwise we
No.
can maybe move on to some
No.
feedback, or at least great. Then this week, in lieu of some feedback and questions, I think we want to touch on, no, not I think, we will touch on what Roger asked last week. And this has been a real hot topic in the news around um, impact of having COVID and then getting the vaccine. And, I believe I said it probably wasn't too big of an issue. It seems like it might be an issue. And again, I think when I talked about it, I felt like, you could argue either way. But it
Yeah.
looks like there is a 6 month wait, right? So, John, tell us a little bit
Yeah.
more about this
So
fascinating Spanish study.
I think Roger's concern was were the additional side effects when having the vaccine administered, and I don't know that we can really necessarily answer that. But what is came out of Spain's government has actually said that individuals who have been infected with the virus should wait for 6 months before being vaccinated, based on growing evidence that the antibodies developed in response to COVID offer long-lasting immunity. Now, I just want to make it clear this is not us offering advice and you should hold off for 6 months. I think that's something to read and discuss with your physician if you do get offered the vaccine. But I think it is interesting that at least in Spain and the WHO also says that people who have said who've had COVID-19 can wait 6 months. There may be some evidence that you don't need to be at the head of the queue. Like I said, we're trying to provide a little bit more color on how we answered last week, just to give you some food for thought. But we're definitely not saying either way how you should move on this.
Yeah, it's still a small sampling size, but John, I mean,
Yep.
I think even, in most of if you talk to people, as more and more people are getting that second vaccine, and so I have some family members and even some individuals that we work with and so forth that have shared, and it's not a big N number. It's like maybe an N of, I think, 5 now that I know that have gotten the second shot. So the first one, pretty
Hmm.
normal sort of site inflammation at the site and a little pain in the arm. But that second one has really led to, maybe feeling like you had COVID for a day, right? Some malaise, some,
Sure.
I don't know, necessarily fever. It's certainly nothing like, I would call it a real mild bout of what was COVID or what we normally think of as like flu-like symptoms. But it has had some people where, their temperature has gotten up to like 101 or 2. But I don't want to deter anybody from taking the
No.
vaccine because of this, because all the people that I've talked to are so happy they've taken the vaccine because it will. And even in the study that says you should wait 6 months, you're kind of protected in that time frame if you've already had it. And we're not going to go down the number of people who have been had COVID twice, because that's still, I think, a very low number.
Yep.
But
Yep.
with that said, I feel like there's certainly, like, it just makes sense that we're going to continue to have evolution of how we want to distribute the vaccine, the
Sure.
impact on it. But overall, John, we're all much safer today. And every day we're going to get a little more safer with
Yep.
vaccines and therapeutics out there.
I totally agree. And actually, the other piece of this was the study, which I really want to read more on. This one is a recent study at the Icahn School of Medicine in Mount Sinai, New York, found that those who have already been infected with the virus had a far higher antibody response following vaccination than those who had not been infected. And the implications for that is they may not need the second dose of a two-dose vaccine. So that to me is the bigger implication here. It might
Yeah.
not be that you hold off for 6 months, but you may only need one dose, and you're much better to go. So I think we're going to hear more about this, because this is just emerged in the last couple of weeks. I think there's going to be more discussion, and we'll obviously keep an eye on it.
Yeah, John, that paper you're referring to that you very, very nicely shows that all signs point to, if you've been infected, getting the vaccine is actually a much more robust response. And that's just that just makes sense, right? In terms of
Mhm.
why you give a boost, right? If you've already been infected. But I mean, obviously, due to just supply, it would be nice and they're showing, so seronegative, this study's still somewhat small, but like, of the seronegative, meaning had no COVID antibodies before they got the vaccine, it was an N of 68, and positive was 41. But I mean, definitely, it's statistically significant how much higher in this case it's the spike COVID-2 antibody. Clearly some really great numbers in terms of the overall titering of those so-called beneficial antibodies or neutralizing antibodies. But John, I think that becomes something as we evolve it. It would be nice to, if we only need one and you're protected, that just gives more for others
Other
to take.
people.
So
Yep.
yeah, I don't know how severe, and none of these studies point to, like, even if you got the vaccine, despite not waiting the 6 months, none of them point towards really detrimental to your health. I want to emphasize that.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, it's we're the focus here is really it's learning about the virus, the vaccine, and its effect on us, and how can we make the vaccine more available to as many people as possible. And this is, I think, this what's driving a lot of these discussions.
Yeah. Well, John, podcast 36 is coming to an end. So
Yep.
let's give me a little bit of feedback on what you've been up to and how your weekend's going.
The we've been doing very little. I think the most recent highlight for us was my daughter got a new cat who
Oh.
is named Tony after someone in The Sopranos, which to my shame I've never watched.
Oh my
Uh,
goodness, John, you're killing me. You've never seen The Sopranos. Oh, that is Tony
it's like
Soprano's the main character, but go on.
he's like this very chunky cat, and it just seemed like a very apt name for him. No, my wife and I have been elsewhere in the viewing universe. We'd spent the last few days in Chernobyl, and finally caught up with that. Just
Oh,
to
good one.
just for a cheery few evenings,
Yeah, I know the
And
series you're talking about, but haven't seen it. Yeah, and, I think it was an HBO series, and maybe it's on Netflix now, but I feel like HBO made one. But that's
yeah,
great.
totally recommend it. It was superb, because I think what triggered us is we actually a few weeks ago we'd been doing the thing of like picking an a film with one letter, and I'd pick the next letter, and my wife would pick the next letter, and I'd pick the next letter. And so we switched from that, and we were looking for just something, a series to watch, and we picked The Last Kingdom, which is in around the 9th century England.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
know the
the
show. Love that show. Lots of seasons to watch there. Good show. Go
so
ahead.
we've done it. That's why. So we did the. So yeah, we loved that. It was great because yeah, just excellent. So then it was like, well, I'm really in this mood to watch some historical stuff, and there's a couple more in the that sort of 9th century time frame that we're going to look at, but we thought we probably want a break from that, so that's why Chernobyl was our next choice. And I'm not sure, having finished that last night, I'm not sure where we're going to go tonight. And in terms of the weekend, all I want to do is get my car washed. We've had snow pretty much every day for the last couple of weeks. Mostly it's small amounts, but then you get all the salt up in your car. So that's going to be my highlight on Saturday. Beyond that, no other plans. So
Yeah,
how about you?
John, and we've had wicked weather over here. I mean, oh my goodness, it's been we're actually it's 23 degrees today, and that's the warmest it's been in probably 2 weeks. We've had some, waking up to -10, -11. We got 4 or 5 inches of snow on the ground. You're right, the car's a mess. Heck, the snow was like staying in the garage, right? Like it's bad when you're not seeing the snow melt on your car when it's inside, right? But so outside of finally coming out of we're supposed to hit the 60s in a couple of days, so it seems like we're maybe when it's been a long winter here. Not so much just on the snow front, but just overall. Normally we get some 50, 60-degree weather. I'm used to maybe taking a bike ride or something. None of that this year. It's just been a long,
Sure.
and it doesn't help with COVID. I mean, on my front, um, been doing a lot of puzzles. I've put together I've been that's been my thing. I've been doing less television and more family time. My son helps out, my wife help out. I of course do the heavy lifting and get the border going and get all the pieces, and they'll swoop in and help out. But I put together since the last time we spoke, I've put together a 1,500-piece puzzle and a 1,000-piece puzzle. They're all like movie themes and fictional books that are movies. It's all
So,
kind of
so I've
movie
got
based stuff.
Yeah, I've gone in that direction too. So it's like because for me doing something like a jigsaw, it stops me going on Twitter and
Yeah,
because I can
no,
spend
it's
hours on there like reading stuff and things like that. But it's a really nice break, and I'm cutting loose of being online and things like that.
yeah.
My tendency tends to be more landscape stuff, particularly if it's somewhere I visited in my various travels. So
Yeah, for me, it's such a good reset. I mean, I kind of go into a whole nother world while I'm working on the puzzle, and then it's been a little bit tough just in general getting any sort of physical activity because of the
sure,
weather and
yeah,
my
yep.
wife is a little like, don't go out in this, but so that it's been, I think it's been healthy just to kind of recalibrate my brain, and I don't know, I'm enjoying them. I got another 4 or 5 to do. It was all my stocking stuffer this year. It was lots of puzzles, and I've been gluing them together and making artwork out of them too. So I've
Okay,
been, not
sure.
only have I been doing puzzles, and I'm not an art, trust me, I'm not an artworker type of guy, but I've been like having to get them into some frames and gluing them together. To me, that's an art project. That's about as much as I'm going to do art wise. But no, and then
So,
of course I'm
I'm
anxiously waiting to use my uni grill for.
just
Yeah, go ahead.
just before you move on, I've just got one last thing on the puzzle thing. I have learned one of the big challenges has been doing it with 6 cats in the house, and particularly 2 1-year-old cats, or particularly one 1-year-old cat who loves the pieces. And if you don't keep an eye on her, she'll bat them off the table, and you'll be like doing things and like, I know that I should have that piece, and it's obvious where it should be, but I can't see it anywhere. Then you check the floor, and there's the
Yeah,
piece on the floor. So when I actually leave it at night, if it isn't finished, I have to put a big cloth over it, then weight the cloth down. But she still digs under the cloth to get the pieces, so that's one of our challenges with doing it. So
yeah.
I'm sorry I interrupted, but
No,
at least
no,
wanted to
and
let you know
I'll
that. So
share my cat, who's, I call her a kitty cat. She's now like 5, but very frisky. Yeah, I'll come down and there'll be a bunch of pieces scattered about, and she'll be looking at me like, "Wasn't me. I know I'm not supposed to be up there," but I do put some stuff over it. But I actually got a mat that allows me to roll it up. So
sure.
my son. If he wants to have his friends down in the basement, I can roll it up on. It's a pretty cool little device to roll it up and get it out of the way. But now I don't know. I might break one open this weekend, but anyhow, John, and that's it in a nutshell. The biggest thing I'm waiting for is I can't wait to try that pizza oven I got, the
Sure.
Uni, and it's just I'm probably a good ways away from using it, but I did buy some pellets and stuff. I think I mentioned that, and I'm anxiously waiting with bated breath to try that out. And I don't know. Even lately, I haven't made anything even exotic cooking wise. It's been kind of a doldrum for me, John, and I'm looking forward to this cold weather getting out of the way so I can, fire up my grill and get
Sure.
back into a good, better spot. Not that it's been super bad, but a bit of drag. Yeah, that'll do it.
I will look forward to doing this again in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks very much, Dominic.